I found the romantic letter her boss had written for her in my wife's purse, and then I announced the divorce, my voice firm and my heart breaking. She tried to deny it, saying it wasn't what I'd imagined, that maybe it was a joke, a harmless provocation, a foolish attempt to make me jealous. But the handwriting was there, carefully drawn, and the intimate words left no doubt. Your perfume lingered on my suit for days, I want to steal your Sundays, one by one, when you hang up the phone, I still hear your breathing. This wasn't something I'd made up. This was pure, painful, silent betrayal. There were no screams, no slamming doors. Just the blunt decision not to insist where the truth was lacking. I got up from the couch, still holding the letter, and said with all the calm I had left, I will not share my life with someone who hides secrets where there should be trust. She tried to stop me, grabbed my arm, and looked at me desperately, as if she were falling into an abyss she'd dug herself. But there was nothing left to hold on to. I left the next day, taking with me only my dignity, and the absolute silence that often comes when the soul realizes it's over. Those were tough months. The kind where you wake up in the middle of the night trying to understand how everything fell apart so quickly. I didn't yell at her. There was no scene. But every day I screamed inside, silently, for everything I believed we had. For every memory that turned into a lie. For every gesture of affection that now seems rehearsed. We slept side by side, shared plans, and she hid notes among the documents. My body was there, sharing the same space, but my presence was already disposable. I thought I knew what pain was until I was betrayed by someone who promised to protect me from the world. The cruelest thing was realizing it wasn't an impulse, it wasn't a one-night stand, it wasn't a drunken mistake. It was a construction. Words exchanged slowly, glances held too long, fake laughs at work dinners, long silences after I asked how their day was. While I was making travel plans, she was practicing excuses. While I was planning a surprise dinner, she was practicing hiding her phone. And yet, when she saw me with the letter in my hand, she had the nerve to call me overreacting, to tell me to calm down, as if I were destroying everything, as if it were my fault for not being able to handle a well-written lie. She swore it was just fantasy, that nothing had really happened, that I was seeing things where there weren't any. And that was what destroyed me most. The coldness. The attempt to manipulate my pain. I was in pieces, and she tried to piece it together with flimsy excuses. But I saw it in her eyes, guilt lives in the gaze of someone who regrets too late. And even if there hadn't been a touch, even if there hadn't been a kiss, if there hadn't been one at all, something far worse had already happened. The break. The break of trust, of bond, of surrender. She stayed. Thinking her boss, that man with the poetic phrases and hidden eyes, would admit something. Maybe she believed he'd drop everything for her. Maybe he'd promised. Or maybe she just fantasized about what she wanted to hear. The truth is, he disappeared. Without saying goodbye, without admitting his feelings, without even responding to the messages he'd previously written with such intensity. He disappeared as if he knew exactly what he was doing. And she was left with the emptiness she'd chosen, staring at her phone like someone waiting for a train that would never arrive. Meanwhile, I rebuilt my life. Not overnight. Not with a new love soon after. But with patience, with silence, with lonely nights that gradually stopped hurting. I started walking alone, choosing the music that played at home, organizing the mess in my room without feeling like someone was missing. And one day, when I least expected it, I met someone. Someone who didn't hide their phone from me, who spoke about their feelings simply, who smiled with their eyes, and who made me feel peace, not doubt. A calm, light love, without secrets. Months later, she came to me. In tears. Her eyes were scarred, her voice choked, and a phrase that seemed rehearsed between sobs, I was an idiot, forgive me. She was thin, her hair cut like someone trying to start from scratch, but her look was the same, that of someone who understands they've lost something they took for granted. I listened, let her speak, let her cry. And finally, I simply said, I forgive you, but I'm not going back. And that was my new beginning. Forgiveness wasn't meant to save her. It was meant to free me. She tried to say more, tried to promise, tried to remake a past that was already buried. But I wasn't the same. Neither was she. And between us, now, there was only memory, and absence. Time passed. She kept trying to find herself. She tried new loves, she tried to move to another city, she tried to forget. But one afternoon, rummaging through a forgotten drawer, she found an old letter. Written by me. A letter from when we were still happy. I spoke of our plans, our lazy Sundays, the house with its large windows and the smell of coffee, the dog we didn't yet have, the trips we would still take. And there, at the end of the letter, I wrote, I promise to cherish our love every day, even when routine tries to tear us apart. And it was there, reading it with trembling hands, that she understood what she had lost. Not a boyfriend, not a husband. But someone who believed in her, who cared, who planned a life with her. And she traded that for sweet words from a man she hadn't even had the courage to stay with. They say time heals all. It's not true. Time teaches. And what she learned, too late, is that when true love is destroyed, there's no second chance to mend what was broken. No matter how much regret, no matter how many tears fell on the pillow. What's done is done. And sometimes, forgiveness comes, but love doesn't come back. But the most curious thing of all wasn't her looking for me, nor his silence, nor the new love I found. The most curious thing was what she discovered inside that letter, something she never imagined existed, something I left there unintentionally, something that reveals that maybe, just maybe, the betrayal began long before she even realized it. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support, and will never support, any form of betrayal. All stories told are fictional, but based on real and painfully human situations. Our purpose is clear, to show how betrayal destroys homes, erodes trust, and tears from the soul what no reconciliation can restore. Get ready. What you're about to hear is more than just a story. It's a warning. It's a narrated scar. It is a reflection of what is lost when you choose to lie. Good story. And may it mark you. In the fall of that year, when the leaves were beginning to gild the sidewalks and the wind blew with a freshness reminiscent of new beginnings, Thomas and Emily seemed to be experiencing a serene phase in their lives. They had been married for almost 7 years, and despite bearing the inevitable marks of coexistence, routine, and the mishaps that time leaves on even the most passionate couples, there was a silent pact of mutual care between them. They weren't perfect, far from it. But they had chosen each other, and that still seemed to mean something. They lived in a house with a light facade, surrounded by mature trees, and there they built not only a home but also a universe of intimate rituals, the coffee Thomas made every morning, with an extra pinch of cinnamon because she liked it that way, the notes Emily left stuck to the bathroom mirror with loving reminders, the impromptu dinners on nights when the week was too heavy. Small gestures that, to outsiders, might seem banal, but to them, they were the threads that held the days together. Emily was a calm-spoken woman with a steady gaze, the kind who always seemed to know her place. She worked as a project coordinator at a marketing firm and stood out not only for her competence but also for the elegance with which she handled pressure, deadlines, and inflated egos. She was respected, admired, and had a unique talent for turning chaos into direction. She was ambitious, but not arrogant, and this endeared her to both colleagues and superiors. Thomas, on the other hand, was more introspective. A civil engineer, he spent much of his day cradling blueprints, calculating, and visiting construction sites. He enjoyed what he did, but even more, he loved the feeling of coming home to find Emily lying on the couch, her cold feet curled around his, a half-full glass of wine between her fingers. He had a gentle manner, a dry sense of humor, and a rare ability to listen, not just with his ears, but with his entire body. He listened with his eyes, with the silence, with the pauses. During the first years of their marriage, they traveled extensively. They enjoyed weekend getaways, exploring small towns, trying new cafes, and leisurely holding hands. They laughed a lot together. There was something about the way they looked at each other, even after so much time, that made it seem like they were still getting to know each other. But, like every story written together, adjustments, personality clashes, accumulated fatigue, and misaligned dreams came along. Emily began to dedicate herself more to work, immersed in presentations, events, and after-hours meetings. Thomas respected her pace, admired her dedication, but sometimes he missed the woman who would laugh as she lay on the living room floor when they played cards on Sunday nights. He tried not to complain. Instead, he made dinner, sorted through her emails when she saw she was exhausted, and found ways to be present even on days when she seemed absent. It wasn't heartbreak. It was life happening. They both knew it. But there was, indeed, something between them that had changed, or perhaps just transformed. Emily, though grateful for everything they'd built, was beginning to feel consumed by a restlessness she couldn't name. A feeling that she was falling behind herself. Sometimes she'd look in the mirror and wonder where she'd left that dreamy version of herself who believed she could conquer the world. Other times, that question came as a whispered guilt as she watched Thomas fall asleep with his face turned toward her. She still loved him, she knew that, but something inside her yearned for something more, and it frightened her. The days were quietly growing shorter between them. There were no arguments, no physical distance, but there was a kind of absence that hurt more than the distance. Breakfasts became more rushed, goodbye kisses more automatic. Conversations revolved around bills, meetings, practical matters. And although they both felt this change, neither spoke about it out loud. There was always a reason for the silence: fatigue, the stress of work, the hope that it was just a phase. Emily told herself that soon she would have more time, more presence, more drive. Thomas tried to convince himself that she was just tired, that it was just the weight of responsibilities. But inside him, a part of him was beginning to doubt. Even so, he continued to care. He fixed her car before she realized the problem, replaced the burned-out light bulbs in the house, kept her favorite wine chilled on Fridays. He continued to treat her with the delicacy of someone who knows no other way to love. She, in turn, felt all of this, but could no longer respond with the same enthusiasm. Something inside her was withdrawing. Work was demanding, but that wasn't all. There was a growing anxiety, a void she tried to fill with productivity, with new goals, with empty hallway conversations. And as the days passed, she felt increasingly distant from the woman who had once been moved to see Thomas on one knee with a simple ring in his hand. There was also the issue of time. The time they spent building a life without realizing they were drifting apart. The time she spent trying to prove her worth in a company that didn't always recognize her. The time he spent trying to keep a structure afloat that was already threatening to crumble. But neither of them dared say it out loud. Instead, they followed their rituals, their tasks, their attempts to keep up appearances. To others, they were the stable, mature, successful couple. But inside the house, there was too much silence where there had once been laughter. One night, after a particularly difficult day at work, Emily arrived home later than usual. She was exhausted, irritable, carrying a tension she couldn't even fathom. Thomas was in the kitchen, preparing something simple. She walked in, left her bag in the corner, took off her shoes without saying a word, and went straight to the bedroom. He understood. He didn't ask, didn't insist. He simply brought her a plate later, along with a glass of wine. She thanked him with a weak smile. They slept with their backs turned. The next day, life went on. This happened a few times. He began to feel like he was becoming invisible, a mere extra in his own house. Not because she despised him, but because she seemed to no longer notice his presence. Emily meant no harm. It was just that her mind was elsewhere. Even so, she still hugged him occasionally, told him she loved him before leaving the house, laughed at his jokes when she could pay attention. Small gestures that gave Thomas the illusion they were still okay. Or maybe they were gestures of someone who, deep down, wanted to believe that. They still went out together sometimes. They went to dinners with mutual friends, attended family gatherings, smiled in photos. But the sparkle that had once been in Emily's eyes was different now. More reserved. Less spontaneous. Thomas could see it, but preferred not to name it. He preferred to believe it was fatigue. That with a little more patience, everything would fall back into place. He still believed in their love. He still saw there, amidst the rubble of everyday life, the woman he had once fallen madly in love with. And he still wanted to fight for her. But there was something Emily needed to figure out for herself. Something no amount of conversation, romantic dinner, or weekend getaway could solve. She was at war with herself, and he had no idea how to help her. And it was precisely there, in that unspoken space between them, that the most dangerous decisions began to be made. What Thomas didn't yet know was that, while he tried to keep the house together with small acts of love, Emily was beginning to lose herself in her own emotions. In confused desires, in stifled needs, in questions she didn't know how to answer. She hadn't done anything wrong yet, not in the traditional sense of the word, but she carried a silent guilt, a feeling that something in her no longer fully belonged in the life they had built together. Time would pass. And, as always, certain truths would wait for the right moment to reveal themselves. Except that when they did, there would be no more room for excuses. And perhaps not even for reconciliation. Routine became the setting where everything happened and, at the same time, where nothing really happened. It was as if time had placed them on different sides of a dark room, each searching for something without knowing exactly what. Thomas would wake up early, leave the coffee ready, and check his emails before heading out for another day of work. Emily, meanwhile, would wake up late, her face still scarred from a sleepless night, her eyes glued to her phone screen as her fingers slid through work messages that seemed to never end. The dynamic between them, though functional, was silently broken. There was a physical presence, but emotional absence was everywhere in the house. She always seemed busy, and he always seemed to try not to disturb her. His every gesture was calculated so as not to burden her further. He felt he loved a woman who was no longer there, and that the space she now occupied was only a memory of what they once were. As the weeks passed, Emily became more absent, not in obvious ways, but in small, almost imperceptible ways. Dinners together became rare. Bedtime conversations became monologues of Thomas trying to maintain some kind of connection. He talked about work, the neighborhood news, his weekend plans, and she nodded, smiled, but rarely returned it with enthusiasm. Her eyes were always elsewhere, as if something was pulling her away, even when his body was there. Thomas wasn't naive, he felt the weight of it, but he tried to rationalize it. He told himself it was just a difficult phase, that her work was demanding, that maybe she was going through something she didn't know how to share. He didn't want to suspect. Suspecting meant admitting something serious was wrong, and he still clung to the idea that love would endure anything, even when that love seemed to be going it alone. The most notable change came when Emily started working late more often. At first, Thomas didn't see a problem. I knew she was dedicated, worked hard, and never the controlling type. But over time, the delays became too frequent, and the reasons too vague. Some nights she'd let me know, others not. He'd say he was in endless meetings, company events, networking dinners. When he tried to engage, ask who she was with, what they were planning, she'd deflect, saying she was too tired to talk about it. There was always an excuse, a tiredness, a reason for the silence. Thomas began to feel like a guest in his own home, someone awaiting the presence of a woman who was no longer part of that household. Sometimes I'd sit at the dinner table waiting for her to arrive, her plate covered in foil. I'd wait until late, and when she finally walked in the door, it was always with the same hurried speech and a kiss on the forehead that said, "Good night," more than, "I love you." The messages between them also diminished. Before, they'd exchanged small notes throughout the day, inside jokes, simple declarations. Now, everything boiled down to logistical communications. "I'm going to be late, can you pick up the car, don't forget the gas bill." The emotional connection faded through the cracks of everyday life, and Thomas tried desperately not to let it destroy him. Until one day, arriving home early, he decided to prepare a special dinner. Nothing special, just a gesture to rekindle something, perhaps a reminder of what they could still be. He put on soft music, lit candles, and prepared her favorite dish. When she walked in the door, she barely noticed. She said she'd already eaten, that she was exhausted, and went straight to the shower. Thomas stood in the living room, staring at the set table, the wine, the food getting cold. That hurt more than any fight. But he still resisted. Still believed. Still had faith. It wasn't attachment. It was love. A love that wouldn't give up easily, even when bleeding. Until, one ordinary morning, while searching for a document in her bag that she herself had requested, something slipped out among the papers, a cream-colored envelope, discreet, but with a detail that caught his eye. Her name was handwritten, in a handwriting that wasn't his own. Thomas hesitated. He considered returning it, pretending he hadn't seen it, but there was something in that envelope that seemed to pulse. He opened it. It was a letter. And as he read, a chill rose in his chest. Soft, intimate, confessional words. Phrases he'd never said, but knew too well to pretend he didn't understand. It was love. Or desire. Or both. It was a man writing to his woman that he loved things no other should write. The letter wasn't about work. It was about longing, about dreamy nights, about restrained touches. About something that had clearly already surpassed any acceptable emotional limit. Thomas stood there, motionless, for a few minutes. The paper trembled in his hands, but his face was calm. There was no visible anger, only a deep, dense sadness that spread through his bones. When she emerged from the shower and found him with the letter in his hand, she paused in the doorway, pale. He simply looked up and said in a low, firm, devastated voice, "You don't need to explain. I understood everything." She tried to react. She told him it wasn't what it seemed, that he was exaggerating, that it was just a joke, a provocation, an unlived fantasy. But nothing she said could erase what he had already read. The words were there, and each one was a knife. He got up, went to the bedroom, and began packing his things into a suitcase. He didn't scream. He hadn't broken anything. He just walked with a kind of pain that didn't allow for explosions. She followed him, crying, begging him to listen, telling him she still loved him, that this didn't have to mean the end. But he said nothing. He packed his suitcase, folded his clothes, put away his books, his shoes, the perfume she always said she liked. When he finished, he looked at her one last time and said, "I'm leaving. Not because I've stopped loving you, but because I love myself enough not to stay where there's no truth." And then he left. Leaving behind the house, the portraits, the history they had built together. But he took something with him, more than his clothes or his books. He took the pain of disillusionment and the dignity of someone who chooses not to beg for anyone's love. She stood in the hallway, listening to the sound of the door closing, tears falling silently, feeling the true weight of what she had lost. What she didn't yet know, what not even Thomas could imagine at that moment, was that within that letter, seemingly just another proof of betrayal, there was something hidden. Something not written in the words, but between the lines. A forgotten detail, an unintentional mark, a fragment of truth that would change everything Thomas had believed until then. And when that fragment came to light, nothing would ever be the same again. Thomas spent the next few days in silence, in a small apartment he'd rented in a hurry, with walls too white and furniture too impersonal for someone who had always valued the intimacy of home. He didn't sleep. He didn't cry. He simply existed, as if observing his own life from a distance, watching everything crumble in slow motion. His bag still sat in the corner of the room, half open, with wrinkled clothes and a perfume that still smelled of longing. He didn't look for anyone, didn't tell any friends or family. Not because he wanted to protect Emily, but because telling her would be confirmation, giving concrete form to something he was still trying to digest in silence. The letter lay inside a black folder, stored among other papers he hadn't the courage to touch, as if it were a body buried beneath layers of rationality. But there was something about that letter that wouldn't leave his mind. Not the words, he'd already memorized those, reread them more times than he'd liked. It was the paper. The paper had a different texture, a discrete coat of arms in the bottom corner. And that sparked a restlessness he didn't understand. He was trying to get back on his feet. He started going to a coffee shop near the new building, walking in the late afternoons, reading old books he never had time to finish. Little by little, I felt my lungs breathing more freely. Emily hadn't insisted. She'd sent 2 messages, asked him to come back and talk, but hadn't pressed further. As if she knew the damage was irreversible. He didn't respond. He knew that if he heard her voice, he might fall back into the cycle of justifications and half-truths. The anger he should have felt was gone. What hurt most was the emptiness. The absence of the future he'd planned for them. The realization that he'd been cast aside by someone he never thought would do this. And, for that very reason, the distrust planted by the letter gave him no peace. One night, already in bed, he remembered the envelope. He got up, went to his briefcase, and picked it up again. He looked closely at the paper, the fold, the pen mark. And then he saw, on the back of the envelope, a small stamp with the name of a hotel. It was discreet, almost invisible, but it was there. A luxury hotel, well known in the city, frequented by executives. His heart raced. It wasn't just a letter written in an ordinary office. It was something left after a meeting, perhaps even as a farewell. This was proof that this wasn't just a verbal provocation. There was a scenario behind those words. The next day, Thomas spent the morning in front of the hotel, observing. I didn't know what I expected to find, but I needed answers. The receptionist recognized him as a longtime client of the construction company, which made the approach easier. Discreetly, she obtained access to previous reservations, not full names, but dates and times. Digging through the records, she found a combination that coincided with Emily's absences. 3 reservations, all on Tuesday nights, in the same weeks she had said she would be in meetings with the design team. Thomas's stomach churned. This was no longer suspicion. It was confirmation. But there was still something more to be understood. That's when he decided to go to Emily's office, under the pretext of returning a forgotten item. He was greeted by a new receptionist, who didn't recognize him but, out of politeness, offered coffee and called a manager to assist him. While he waited, he noticed, in the hallway, a board with photos of internal company events. In one of them, Emily was smiling next to a man Thomas had never seen before. Tall, handsome, with a gaze too direct for a photograph. In the corner of the photo, a sign with the name of the event, a symposium held in another state. When he casually asked about the image, the manager replied matter-of-factly, "Oh, that was at the annual event in Charleston. I remember it well, because that was the last time that guy showed up around here. He disappeared off the map. He didn't even say goodbye. He left everything behind." Thomas froze. That was the man in the letter. The boss. The lover. And he had disappeared right after the end of the relationship. The information haunted him for the next few days. There was something unresolved there. An absence that made no sense. He began investigating, unsure of what exactly he was looking for. He found old social media profiles, little information. He discovered that the man had moved, that he was in another state. But the most disturbing part came later. On a deactivated social media platform, he found old photos. In one of them, the man appeared with a blonde woman and a caption that read, "She said yes. I can't wait for our future." The post was dated 6 months before his first date with Emily at the hotel. The man was engaged. He was about to get married while writing letters to another woman. Thomas didn't know how to process it. On impulse, he called Emily. She answered with a shaky voice, perhaps surprised to see his name on the screen. He didn't shout. He just asked to talk. They said little on the phone. They arranged to meet at a park they often went to. Their reunion was silent at first. She seemed nervous, he, restrained. Until he placed the envelope on the bench between them and asked, "Did you know he was engaged?" Emily hesitated. She looked away. She tried to change the subject, but he persisted. "Did you know or not?" She then confessed. Her voice choked, her eyes filled with tears. She said she found out by chance, after seeing a notification on his phone with a photo of his fiancée. That she confronted him, that he denied it, then confessed, then asked her to keep it a secret. That he promised to end things and be with her, but then disappeared. She said she felt used, ashamed, regretful, and that she didn't know how to tell Thomas. That she didn't want him to know that, besides having betrayed him, she had also been deceived. Thomas listened to her in silence. Each word was a blow. Not only because of the betrayal, but because it confirmed that he had been replaced by someone who never intended to stay. And that, even after knowing this, she chose to hide the truth. His silence lasted for long seconds. And then he said, "You didn't just betray me with him. You betrayed me with what you became to fit the desires of someone who lied to both of you." She wept, but he remained unmoved. Not because of coldness, but because there was nothing left to salvage. He stood up, looked at her one last time, and said, "You destroyed something that will never exist again. And now, I finally understand that it wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment choice. It was a choice of values." She tried to justify herself, saying she was confused, needy, that she hadn't imagined he would disappear like that. But he no longer needed explanations. What he wanted, he had gotten, the truth. Confirmation that she not only cheated, but allowed herself to be deceived, and hid it until the end. And it was there, on that bench, that Thomas buried once and for all the love that once made him believe they would last forever. But what he didn't yet know, what neither of them knew, was that there was more to the story. Something that was still hidden, forgotten in a drawer, and that would forever change the way she saw everything she'd lost. Emily sat on the park bench for long minutes after Thomas left, as if his absence left an echo in the air. The sun was already beginning to set, tinting the trees with orange hues that seemed to mock the emptiness that now filled everything around them. She held the envelope between her fingers as if time could be reversed, as if tearing it up could erase the mistakes. But there was nothing she could do. He was gone, for real this time. Not like in the weeks before, where the silence between them was a form of departure, still disguised. Now he was gone with his feet, with his eyes, with his soul. And Emily felt the weight of what she had lost with brutal clarity. In the days that followed, she tried to carry on. She continued going to work, wearing her well-pressed suits, answering emails punctually, delivering projects with precision. But inside, she was crumbling. It wasn't just the guilt of betrayal. It was the shame of having believed a man who used her as a distraction while he built another life. It was the remorse of having remained silent when she should have been honest. But most of all, it was the hole left by Thomas's absence. Not just the man, but the peace he brought, the emotional security, the unassuming affection, the respect. Emily realized she'd never been with anyone as kind as he was. And also that she'd never been so cruel to someone who had only tried to love her as completely as possible. She began to frequent the places they'd once gone together, as if searching for a version of herself she'd left behind. She sat in cafes where he read books, walked streets where they'd often talked about the future, returned to the small markets where he always insisted on choosing the wine. Everything hurt. Everything reminded her. Everything screamed what she didn't want to hear, that she'd lost something that couldn't be rebuilt. It wasn't just regret. It was the awareness that time doesn't forgive, and that love, once broken like this, rarely becomes whole again. One afternoon, while organizing her personal files, an almost unconscious move toward getting her own life in order, she came across an old box filled with papers, old letters, mementos from the beginning of her marriage. There, among romantic notes and tickets from old trips, she found an envelope Thomas had left for her years before, on their third wedding anniversary. She didn't remember reading it. Maybe she was too busy at the time. Maybe she simply forgot. The fact is, there it was, carefully folded, the scent of his cologne still lingering on the paper. She read slowly, as if each word had the power to open another wound. He wrote about what he admired in her, about the plans he had for them both, about how he wanted to grow old with her. He said he loved her not for the good times, but mostly for the way they faced the hard times together. And at the end, almost like a cruel premonition, a sentence closed the letter with a sweetness that now hurt. If one day I no longer know how to show you how much I love you, remind me with this paper. Emily clutched the letter to her chest, her eyes closed, her body hunched as if trying to hide from herself. The pain was physical. As if something had broken inside and she knew nothing, absolutely nothing, could be done to fix it. Days later, fate, with its bitter irony, dealt the final blow. Emily was invited to a corporate dinner at a hotel in the city. A common event, without great expectations. It was simply part of protocol. But as she walked up to one of the private rooms where the dinner would take place, she noticed something in the hallway, a wall of wedding photos from the area. It was a new decoration, apparently. Couples posing beside the room's fireplace, smiles frozen in gilded frames. She scanned the room distractedly until one image stopped her. A couple. The man was smiling. The woman was blonde, wearing a simple, elegant dress. And the groom, it was him. The man she had risked everything for. The same one who had written the letters. The date of the photo was there, written underneath in clear letters, 3 days after their last meeting. The ground seemed to drop from under her feet. The world spun, and she could barely breathe. This wasn't just confirmation that he was engaged, it was the realization that he'd used her until the very last moment, while preparing his own vows to another woman. Emily left the hotel in a daze, wandering aimlessly, trying to understand how she'd let herself get carried away, how she'd been so blind. And, most of all, why she'd chosen to hurt the one man who had always been true to her. That night, she called Thomas. Not to apologize, she knew she no longer deserved that, but because she needed to say something. He answered after several long seconds. His voice was firm but cold. She said she had something to tell him. She told him about dinner. She told him about the photo. She told him she had discovered the truth about that man and how betrayed she felt, too. Thomas listened in silence. When she finished, he simply said, "Now you understand." She wanted to say yes, that she understood. But she understood that it no longer mattered. Her pain, however genuine, didn't heal the pain she had caused. She asked if she could see him. Just for a moment. He declined. He said he was moving on. That there was someone who could make him smile again, who treated him with respect, who didn't need to hide his feelings or apologize for loving her. Emily listened to it all with a broken heart. His voice was still the most familiar she'd ever known, but now it sounded like part of another life, one she'd lost by choice. She hung up without another word, the knowledge of what she'd done finally outweighing the pain of abandonment. Thomas, on the other end of the line, took a deep breath. The phone was still in his hand, as if holding the last link to a past he now needed to bury once and for all. He looked at the sofa where he now sat with someone else. Someone who had entered his life lightly, unhurriedly, undemandingly. She didn't know everything he'd been through, but she offered something he thought no longer existed, peace. She looked at him tenderly, truthfully, with a quiet affection that required no explanation. For the first time in months, Thomas felt something close to relief. Not revenge. But liberation. The next morning, Emily sat on her bed, still dressed in her clothes from the day before. He opened his laptop and began typing. Not an email. Not a new letter. But a text to herself. A confession. An attempt to understand how she had become what she swore she would never be. The words came out like daggers. She wrote about feeling deceived, but also about how she chose to ignore the signs. About choosing to run away rather than face the problems in her marriage. About how, out of pride, she stopped telling Thomas she loved him when there was still time. The last line was written with tears in her eyes. I lost the one who truly loved me because I preferred to be desired by someone who only knew how to pretend. She saved the document and closed her laptop. She knew none of it would change what had happened. But she needed to record it. If only to remind herself, every day, of what she had done. Of what she had lost. And, most importantly, what I could never recover. In the days following Thomas and Emily's final conversation, life, with its uncanny ability to move forward even amidst the rubble, slowly began to shift. He, now settled into a calmer routine, had learned to breathe differently. Not with the anxiety of someone waiting for a return that never comes, but with the calm of someone who has accepted that certain losses are irreparable. He no longer reviewed old messages, no longer felt the need to visit the places he once shared with her. He had made peace with the idea that loving someone isn't enough when they don't know the value of what they have. He began to discover a new version of himself, not better, not worse, just more aware, less romantic, more sober. A version that now walked alongside someone who offered care instead of blame, presence instead of absence, sincerity instead of uncertainty. On the other side, Emily was immersed in a slow and painful process of forced self-discovery. The nights were long, the days silent, the thoughts sharp. Work, once a source of pride, now felt like a theater where she pretended to be whole. The figure she saw in the mirror seemed like a different woman, older from the emotional weight she carried than from time itself. And that was what hurt most. Time seemed to have stopped for her, while for Thomas, it flowed. She could see it in the discreet photos she saw on social media, in moments of weakness, in the images of calm smiles, in the simplicity of his new daily routine. He seemed light. While she seemed buried under the weight of her own choices. One afternoon she saw him from afar, by chance. He was in a market, laughing with someone nearby. The woman was holding a bag of fruit, saying something, and he responded with a smile Emily knew well. It destroyed her. Not because she wanted him to be sad, but because she never imagined seeing him happy with someone else could hurt so much. She stood there, watching from afar, motionless, as if the image before her were part of a dream she herself had decided to abandon. And it was in that moment that she understood that it wasn't just the end of a relationship, it was the end of a version of life she chose not to live anymore. Not because it was taken from her. But because she herself had given it away. She didn't seek contact. She didn't try any more messages, any more calls. She understood that any words now would be too little, too late. The only thing left for her was to deal with the silence, with the lack of redemption. And perhaps that was what tore her apart the most, that there was no redemption possible. Not from him, who had already moved on. And not from her, who now understood that forgiveness is not the same as reconciliation. That repentance, no matter how genuine, cannot buy back what was destroyed by one's own hand. Thomas, for his part, was experiencing a more internal, quieter dilemma. Even though he was in a new, true, light relationship, he still remembered everything he'd experienced. Not with longing, but with a kind of bitter respect. He knew that marriage had been real, even if the ending was tragic. And because of that, he carried a different maturity in his gestures, in his eyes, in the way he listened to his new partner. He no longer idealized. Now he saw clearly. He didn't expect eternal promises, but real commitment. He didn't ask for guarantees, but transparency. And this made him live with greater awareness, but also with a certain constant vulnerability. Because those who have had their hearts broken don't love innocently, they love courageously. There was a moment when, while organizing some forgotten papers in a wooden box, Thomas found an old notebook. It was a diary of ideas, plans, and random notes he made on ordinary days. On one of the pages was a list of wishes for the future: the house with a garden, the dog they never got to adopt, the names of children they imagined having. He read each item calmly, like someone watching a movie whose ending they already know. He didn't cry. He simply closed the notebook, put it back, and understood that some pages in life are not meant to be torn out, but to be closed with dignity. Emily, increasingly aware of the depth of the void she had created, began to distance herself from everything that reminded her of that life. She moved apartments, cut her hair, started over from scratch. But nothing seemed enough to erase the mark left by her choices. Nights were still haunted by memories, by strange dreams where he would appear smiling, then turning his back. He began writing more frequently, no longer as a way to vent, but as an attempt to understand. What had driven her to this? At what point had she become so distant from herself that she hurt the ones she loved most? The answers didn't come all at once, but rather in fragments. Pride, neediness, vanity, fear. He realized he hadn't just betrayed Thomas, he betrayed his own values. And that was the kind of betrayal that was hardest to forgive. Once, she ran into an old classmate, a distant friend from college. They chatted by chance, exchanged memories, and laughed over old stories. The friend commented, unaware, "You and Thomas were my favorite couple. I always thought you two would last forever." Emily smiled painfully. She didn't try to explain. She didn't say she destroyed everything on a whim. She simply nodded, like someone carrying a cross that no longer needed to be exposed. That was it now, a silent burden. A story no one knew in its entirety. A pain she carried alone. Thomas's new life was built with small bricks. Every gesture from his new partner, every display of sincere care, was like a foundation. There were no grand demonstrations, but there was consistency. And that was all he needed. One day, at a simple dinner, she held his hand and said, "You don't have to be strong all the time. Here, you can rest." He didn't respond immediately, but in that moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, acceptance. Not because he was perfect, but because he was human. And it was then that he understood that true love doesn't require you to prove yourself, it simply accepts you. Emily continued her rebuilding process, still unsure of where it would all lead. She knew she needed to move on, but she didn't know how to do it without carrying the guilt. She began volunteering, met new people, read books about starting over, and tried to rebuild herself with every small gesture. But there was always that void that no amount of action could fill. Because it wasn't a lack of love, it was a lack of inner forgiveness. It was the pain of having been truly loved and having destroyed that with her own hands. A moral dilemma that would haunt her for a long time: how can you live in peace when you know you deeply hurt someone who never did anything to deserve it? Their story, though closed, continued to exist in fragments scattered throughout the world. A song that played randomly, a restaurant that served their favorite dish, a perfume forgotten in an old coat. Life offers no clean cuts. Bonds unravel little by little, like threads pulled until nothing remains. And while Thomas began to feel whole again, Emily learned to live with the scar of having once been the cause of the ruin of something pure. And there was still one final piece to this story. Something tucked away in the back of a drawer, forgotten among memories, waiting to be discovered. A piece that wouldn't change the outcome, but would bring the final layer of understanding to everything that had happened. And when she finally found it, she would understand that the pain she caused had an even greater reach than she imagined. It was late afternoon when Emily, rummaging through old boxes in search of documents for a new personal project, came across an aged leather folder, forgotten at the bottom of a high shelf in the closet. She opened it without much thought, simply out of habit, expecting to find papers of little value, loose notes, old bills. But among the disorganized pages, a letter folded in half fell to the floor. The paper was already yellowing at the edges, but the handwriting immediately struck her as familiar. Not Thomas's, but that of the man who had been her boss. Her ex-lover. The author of the letter that had destroyed her marriage. For a moment, she considered simply tearing up the paper and moving on with her life, but something about the lightness with which it fell to the floor seemed to demand attention. She sat down, still on the cold floor of the apartment, unfolded the letter, and began to read. But it wasn't a letter addressed to her. It was an incomplete note, perhaps a draft. And in it, he wrote about his fiancée, about his fears of being discovered, about how Emily had become a liability. The words felt like a punch, as if someone were throwing salt into an open wound. She started to believe too much. I need to walk away before she causes trouble. I want to resolve this without scandal. I've gone too far. Emily froze. This wasn't just a betrayal of Thomas, it was also a betrayal of her. A double betrayal, cruel, cold. She wasn't just complicit in a mistake. She was used. And for the first time, she understood that, besides being guilty, she was also the victim of an illusion built on manipulation. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat on the couch for hours, the letter resting on her lap, staring into space, replaying every conversation, every gesture, every moment she thought she was in control. Clarity came like a blade. She hadn't cheated out of love, nor out of true desire, much less out of impulse. She cheated because she'd been deluded, led to believe she was special to someone who only saw her as an escape. And in the name of that illusion, she sacrificed the only thing that was truly real in her life, Thomas. The truth, now complete, offered no solace. Only weight. The kind of weight no one can share with you. Unsure of what to do with it, she decided she wouldn't tell Thomas. Not anymore. He was in a different phase of life, walking in peace, loving someone new. It wouldn't be fair to thrust one last revelation upon him just to ease her own conscience. He no longer needed the truth, he had already learned to live without it. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson: not all guilt finds redemption, not all pain needs to be shared. Some are yours, and yours alone. And living with them is part of the penance. She put the letter away again, this time in a locked box. Not as denial, but as a memorial. A permanent reminder of the line she should never have crossed. Meanwhile, Thomas was living a new chapter. He had moved with his new partner to a quieter neighborhood, a house with a porch and a garden, something he had wanted for years but never managed to achieve. Now, the mornings smelled of fresh coffee and soft laughter. She wasn't Emily, nor did she try to be. She had a serene way of existing, of respecting his space, of building intimacy without haste. And this made him feel safe, free from ghosts. The memory of his old relationship no longer haunted him, but it still served as a reference. It was the silent reminder of how much he had suffered and how much he deserved to be at peace now. He wasn't deluded that this new relationship would be perfect, but he knew there was something there that hadn't been there before, truth from the beginning. One rainy night, returning from a visit to his parents' house, Thomas parked his car in the garage and, upon entering, found his partner reading on the couch. She looked up and said, with the tone of someone discussing something important, "You've told me everything about what happened before me, except one thing: have you forgiven yourself?" He fell silent. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because perhaps he'd never really thought about it. For a long time, he thought forgiveness was about others. About Emily. About what she did. About what she failed to do. But in that moment, he realized that, on some level, he also carried the guilt of having stayed too long, of having ignored the signs, of having kept quiet to maintain a relationship that already screamed for change. He sat beside her and replied, in a whisper, "I'm learning." She took his hand, squeezed it lightly, and simply said, "It's a start." Emily, for her part, tried to find a new direction in her life. She began therapy, pursued courses in areas she'd always been interested in, and began dedicating part of her time to social causes. She wanted, somehow, to do something good with what remained of her. But nothing had the same shine as before. Not because the world had lost its beauty, but because she herself had lost the ability to see herself without guilt. The looks she received, the compliments at work, the new invitations, everything seemed empty. As if any success was now an undeserved prize. The letter hidden in the box served as a daily reminder that she had been deceived, yes, but that no one forced her to deceive. That she chose to betray. That she was responsible for hurting someone who only knew how to love her. And this couldn't be erased with good deeds. It could be soothed, perhaps. But it couldn't be erased. There was a day when she thought about writing a book. A sort of anonymous confession. Writing as a way to try to transform pain into narrative. But she soon abandoned the idea. It wasn't redemption she sought. It was understanding. And perhaps even that wasn't necessary anymore. Sometimes the greatest punishment isn't being punished, but having to go on with life knowing exactly what you did. And she knew. She knew every detail. Every lie. Every complicit silence. She knew the exact line where she lost love and herself. Thomas no longer thought about her. Not with pain, not with longing. When he remembered, it was as if he were remembering a distant time, a younger, more naive version of himself. Now, what moved him was the present. The quiet Sunday lunches, the walks at the end of the day, the lightness of lying next to someone and knowing there was reciprocity. Life had become possible again. And more than that, it had become beautiful again. And there wasn't a single space in that new world that still belonged to Emily. But fate, with its silent irony, still held one last move in store. One last chance for the two to cross paths. Not for reconciliation. But for definitive closure. Because certain stories, no matter how much they seem over, only truly end when the final truth is revealed. And it was coming. Not to unite. But to seal. To conclude what began with a letter. And would end with a choice. Months passed until chance brought them face to face once more. It wasn't on any street, nor in a planned situation, but rather at a charity event to which they had both, unknowingly, been invited by different people. She, now involved in social projects as a way to reconnect with herself, had accepted the invitation out of courtesy. He, in turn, was there accompanying his new partner, who was organizing part of the event. The room was spacious, lit by soft lights and decorated with elegant simplicity. And when Emily's eyes met Thomas's across the room, for a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. There was no shock, no drama. Just absolute silence between two worlds that no longer touched. He was serene, beside the woman who now shared his days. Emily remained still, her fingers gently squeezing the wineglass, her heart pounding beneath her skin, as if suddenly remembering what had once been, and what would never be again. They didn't exchange words that night. Just glances. But in that single instant, something happened. Something definitive. Emily realized, without him needing to say a single word, that he had ceased to be hers. Not out of anger, not out of resentment, but out of evolution. He had moved on. And she hadn't. The difference between them now wasn't what they had experienced, but what each had done with the pain. Thomas transformed it into maturity, into healthy love, into rebuilding. Emily transformed it into absence, into long nights and regrets stitched between memories. That was harder than any argument. More painful than any letter read. It was the end, blatantly revealed with the coldness of someone who no longer owes anything. That same night, already at home, Thomas found a small box among his belongings he hadn't opened since moving. Inside, an old wedding ring, forgotten among documents. He stared at it for a long time, turning it over in his fingers, and then calmly placed it in a drawer and closed it. Nothing more needed to be explained. He didn't hate what they'd been through. Quite the opposite. He would be grateful for having learned, for having grown. But he didn't miss it. That was in the past. A chapter closed with all the full stops it deserved. And now he was writing a new story, with simple lines, but written with all his soul. Emily, on the other hand, didn't sleep that night. Images of that encounter played through her mind like a poorly edited movie. She didn't know what hurt more, seeing him happy or knowing she no longer had the right to even get close. She envied not the woman beside him, but the woman she herself had ceased to be when she chose the path of lies. She missed herself, that version he loved, that woman who had value in the eyes of someone pure. And it was that night, in an almost instinctive act, that she did what she had never done before. She wrote a letter she hadn't intended to send. She wrote with pain, with regret, but also with honesty. She told everything, not as an apology, but as a final confession. She spoke of the man who deceived her, of the letter she found too late, of the weight she carried every day for having destroyed a pure love in the name of a dirty fantasy. He ended the letter with a simple but definitive sentence: "You loved me like no one will ever love again, and I destroyed that with my own hands. I understand why you won't come back. And, as much as it hurts, I accept it." She folded the letter carefully, placed it in a drawer, and locked it. It wouldn't be sent. It was hers alone. A symbolic epitaph of the love she buried with her own betrayal. And in that silent gesture, she understood that certain mistakes aren't meant to be fixed. They're meant to be remembered. So that they never happen again. And there, in that intimate silence, she accepted that her punishment wouldn't be loneliness, but memory. Because memory hurts more when nothing can be done about it. In the following months, Thomas deepened his bond with the woman who was now his true partner. Together, they built a relationship based on transparency, without grand promises, but with small actions that spoke volumes. She knew everything. She knew his past, his pain, the history he carried. But she never used it against him. On the contrary, she used it to care. To welcome. To show that love doesn't have to be perfect to be true. He, in turn, learned to trust again. He learned to open up, to talk about his weaknesses, to share his small anxieties. And with that, he discovered that it wasn't about replacing the old love, but about rewriting what love could mean. Emily didn't get involved with anyone for a long time. Not because she didn't want to, but because she understood she needed to rebuild herself before inviting anyone to share anything. Her social presence diminished, her posts became more discreet, her life more private. That confident woman who once walked in high heels between the company desks now walked with more measured steps, less hurried. She hadn't lost her strength, but she had lost the vanity that made her feel superior to the consequences. Now she carried a sad but dignified elegance. Like someone who knows they carry a name that once held value but has lost its luster due to their own mistake. Their story involved no reunion, no apology, no reconciliation. And perhaps that's why it was so real. Because in life, not every wound heals with a hug. Sometimes it heals with distance. With silence. With the courage to move forward without turning back. And that was their choice. Thomas with the new life he'd built. Emily with the one they had left. And although they follow opposite paths, there is an invisible bond between them that can never be broken, the memory of everything they were, and the moment when everything was lost. And now I want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? What was the moment that touched you most? Comment below with your opinion and your perspective on everything that happened. Your interaction is very important to us and strengthens this channel. If you've made it this far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more stories like this, stories that show the most human, fragile, and genuine side of love and its loss. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any episodes. And may this story serve as a reflection. Betrayal is not just an act of impulse. It's a choice. And every choice has a price. A price that is often higher than imagined. It destroys more than trust, it destroys respect, love, dreams, and even the image a person had of themselves. And when everything falls apart, there's not just regret left, there's the emptiness of knowing that what was lost can never be recovered. The channel emphasizes, here, we do not support any type of betrayal. Our goal is to expose the consequences of these acts so that they serve as a warning, a mirror, and, most importantly, a learning experience. Until the next story.